It's a recession when your neighbor loses his job. It's a depression when you lose your own. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today, economy on a knife edge. Is there a way out? Navigating Sri Lanka's economy in turbulent weather. Joining us this evening on the show are Rajendran Tyagaraja, senior banker, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce; Suresh Shah, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce; Professor Udara Peiris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. Also joining us via Zoom tonight on the show is Professor Shanta Devarajan, member on the Advisory Committee on Debt. He's also the former chief economist of the World Bank as well. He will join us momentarily as the show goes on. Let's start off tonight's show with Professor Udara Peiris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. Udara, interestingly, there was a complete wrap of the meeting that was held recently in Washington, D.C., along with the IMF officials and the Sri Lankan delegation headed by the Minister of Finance, President's Counsel Ali Sabri. Right after this meeting in question, there was a statement that was issued. The IMF says, going forward, the IMF team will support Sri Lanka's efforts to overcome the current economic crisis by working closely with the authorities on the economic program and by engaging with all other stakeholders in support of a timely resolution of the crisis. Does that mean the IMF is going to positively engage with Sri Lanka in giving us some money immediately to the problems that we are facing at present? Your time starts now.
Thank you, Shamir, and glad to be on the show. So the delegation to DC, I think overall we should consider this relatively successful delegation, even though we haven't got any tangible outcome back. It's successful in the sense that we've, as I understand, presented our case in a very professional way to the IMF. The IMF has responded with these statements to say that they understand our situation and they're ready to work towards actually coming up with a concrete proposal. There's two sides to this. One is the short-term financing, which you mentioned, and as I understand, this is in the works. There's definitely going to need to be a few more weeks to try and get some of this funding. But the real question isn't the short-term money. It's really what is the IMF program that we can agree to, which will allow us to ultimately regain access to the markets. So when we look at this statement, we should take it in the context of this longer-term, larger program, which is ultimately going to require a certain consensus among Parliament and the political system.
Udara, we all know, before we went to the IMF, that debt sustainability would be one of the core agendas as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. How do you think the Sri Lankan delegation presented its facts to the IMF team with regard to overcoming this situation, with regard to debt sustainability itself? Do we have a good case here?
I think the committee that went to the IMF was in a very difficult position because when you present a case of debt sustainability, it depends what the political system is willing and able to implement. Now, if the debt is 100% of GDP, but you have a government that says we're going to grow at 50% every year, it's sustainable. At the moment, we don't really have political leadership. We don't definitely have economic leadership. So what they have done, I think, is presented the facts as they are, and they presented the current humanitarian aspects and the short-term financing needs. They're in a very difficult position. They can't really agree to anything because they don't have a mandate. They can't promise anything because nobody knows what the political outcome is going to be. So in this environment, I think they've done the best that they can.
Udara, at any given meetings or any successful meetings that are usually held in the Sri Lankan context, the Sri Lankan delegation seems to be very jubilant over talks that are held. But isn't this too early to be jubilant over matters that are concerning not only Sri Lanka, but overall the entire gamut of people in the country as well? Is it far too early to be jubilant?
So it was, this meeting was a technical meeting. There's nothing really to celebrate other than the fact that we have handled, as I see it, handled it quite professionally. this very simple technical first round of meetings. We can understand if this process has been successful in the next coming 3-4 weeks, if we can actually get them to release a certain amount of money up front and start to work towards a program to get us back into the financial markets. But definitely there's nothing to celebrate and be jubilant about right now.
Udara, interestingly, many countries have now come to Sri Lanka's rescue. We just heard that the government of Italy is providing Sri Lanka with $175 million in aid to purchase pharmaceutical products. Then the Indian government has said that they will support Sri Lanka. The Chinese government has been somewhat negative with regard to going to the IMF, but they've said that they will support the country as well. Sri Lanka initially went to the Russian Federation as well for help. Is there any concrete decision by the Russian authorities to help Sri Lanka in this hour of need?
I don't know. I don't have any information beyond what's public. However, in the last few years, the Russian government has been making inroads into Sri Lanka, has been offering, as I understand, there was an offer of fuel in the last 12 months. Whether this has been utilized and whether Sri Lanka is able to make use of whatever Russia can provide, I don't know. But
would they be in a situation to help Sri Lanka given the current Ukraine-Russian conflict?
Russia is a country with enormous resources. It's really a question whether we as a country of Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's people want to engage with this and to what extent we want to engage. But there's definitely, if we do want to engage, there's a lot of potential for us to gain, especially in the short term.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Udara Paris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. I now move my attention to Professor Shant Devarajan, member of the Advisory Committee on Debt, former Chief Economist of the World Bank, who is joining us via Zoom. Professor Devarajan, nice to have you on board, and thank you very much for joining us on a very short notice, and thanks a lot for being on Face the Nation tonight.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Right. So starting off, Professor, you were appointed a member of the Advisory Committee on Debt several weeks ago by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, you alongside with two other members. One of them was the former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, who is a celebrated economist as well as a celebrated central bank governor as well. What was the first advice you all gave the government with regard to debt restructuring?
Well, just to be clear, we've been giving advice to the government for the last 9 months. And the advice was undertake a debt restructuring and approach the IMF for a program. But as you know, that advice was not taken until about January, February. And so the first piece of advice we gave after we were appointed was actually to go ahead and try to implement both of those decisions, which is undertaking a debt restructuring. And the point there was to submit a request for proposals for a debt advisor, a financial advisor and a legal advisor in order to proceed with the negotiations with the creditors. And with respect to the IMF, we wanted to initiate discussions with the IMF about various aspects of fiscal adjustment that would accompany the debt restructuring process, but more importantly would be the components of a IMF program, which would then also enable Sri Lanka to obtain resources both from the IMF, and in turn, that would release some resources from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and possibly other bilateral partners. Just to add, the third piece of advice which we gave and we were working on is to seek bridge financing during this period of debt restructuring, because the country needs resources to buy imports, as we've seen, foreign exchange resources. And one of the features of a period of debt restructuring is that you can't go out and borrow more money while you're restructuring your debt. So we needed, on a temporary basis, some bridge financing in order to buy imports over the next 4 to 6 months.
So you speak about bridge financing, and this was one of the points that was brought forward by Professor Daraperis as well in his opening remarks. Now, when you are in a dire need for funds, Professor Devarajan, we have to have bridge financing to make sure that we are provided with the necessary fuel, food, medicine, pharmaceutical products, and so on and so forth. But I find the recent statement made by the Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka rather complex to understand. Now, the ambassador says that Sri Lanka's decision to seek IMF assistance has slowed down negotiations over the country's assistance of obtaining $2.5 billion in debt, as restructuring has a future impact on bilateral loans. Can you decode this for me, please, Professor?
Yeah, I just saw that a few hours ago. So here would be my interpretation of that. You see, in addition to seeking requesting for a financial advisor and a legal advisor, Sri Lanka also took the decision to suspend payment on any debt service payments coming due in the next 6 months or so, while they're undertaking the debt restructuring. And frankly, they had to do that. There wasn't enough foreign exchange reserves in order to meet the debt service payments, including $1 billion in July that were coming due. Now, a principle of debt restructuring is what's called intercreditor equity. That is, you treat all creditors equally in terms of reducing the debt. So you reduce the present value of the debt, whether it's through postponement or haircuts on the interest or the principal, in such a way that every creditor is treated equally. But that means that China, which is a creditor, will be treated alongside the other creditors, in fact, the other official creditors like Japan and India and the United States and the UK. And I have a feeling that that's what's behind that statement by the Chinese. They wanted to have a separate negotiation on this 1.5 billion that would be outside of the debt restructuring negotiations, which is similar to what China did recently in Zambia, in the case of Zambia's debt restructuring. And I have a feeling that's the code that's expressed in this disappointment that Sri Lanka has gone for a debt restructuring, which means that there will be no separate treatment of China separate from the treatment of all the other creditors.
Professor, probably the Chinese ambassador may be thinking that if we did not go for the IMF technical meetings that was held in Washington, D.C., Sri Lanka would be in such a dire situation and we probably would be up for sale.
I don't know. But the point is that if it's not going to the IMF meetings, that was the issue, I think, even though that's what they said. It was that decision to postpone debt service payments and undertake a debt restructuring. That was the big decision that affects the Chinese debt as well as everybody else's debt. I mean, going to the IMF meetings, Sri Lanka is a member of the IMF. They go to the meetings all the time. That's just a standard operating procedure. And
we've obtained assistance from IMF at least 16 times, Professor, in the past as well. Professor, now you spoke earlier and you said that you all have been giving advice to the government of Sri Lanka alongside the central bank for 9 months regarding debt restructuring. I'm not talking about the last 9 months. Let's talk about the time that you all were appointed as advisory committee members on debt. Is the government giving you all open this point of time? Are they listening to you?
Oh yes, very much. And in particular, the new governor of the central bank, Nandalal Veerasinghe, and the new secretary of the Treasury, Mahinda Siriwardena, they're the newly appointed members of the team, and they are listening to us, and in fact, we are listening to them. I mean, I think we're really very much part of a team, and I feel like we're very much on the same wavelength. And the evidence is in just 2 weeks, I don't know how long ago, was it 3 weeks that Nandalal was appointed, the number of hard decisions they have taken, all of which were consistent with our advice in the past, but they actually took those decisions, including calling for the legal and financial advisors, raising interest rates. These were hard decisions, but they had to be taken, and they're on the path to achieving a restructured debt.
Professor, were you also part of the members or delegation that met the IMF while the Sri Lanka delegation was in Washington, D.C.?
No, the three of us were our advisors to the delegation. So we met with the delegation before they met with the IMF.
Right.
So we had several hours of discussions with the Minister, Ali Sabri, with the Governor, and with the Secretary of the Treasury, all as a sort of preparatory meeting to discuss what positions to take and what facts to share and so on. And then they went and had the meetings. Since we were not part of the official delegation, we should not have been at the meeting with the IMF.
Right.
But that said, since I spent 28 years at the World Bank, I know all of these people, and I had several conversations with the IMF team as well as with the World Bank team about this issue during the meetings as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Shanda Devarajan, member of the Advisory Committee on Debt, a former chief economist of the World Bank as well. Hang in there, Professor Devarajan will connect with you momentarily after we pick Suresh's and Mr. Tyagaraja's brains on how the country's economy should be steered. So I want to move my attention to Suresh Shah, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Suresh, interestingly, the most urgent need at the moment as far as Sri Lanka is concerned is bridge financing. We have to obtain fuel, we have to obtain food, pharmaceutical products, medicine, so on and so forth. How much of financing are we talking about? Where is it going to come from? And how soon can Sri Lanka get it?
So there are three things that we need to focus on, Shamir. The immediate issue of getting the essentials back into the hands of the people, the fuel, the power, the gas, the medicines, and so on and so forth. Then we need to stabilize the economy. And thirdly, we need to put the economy back on a growth path. So your question really relates to the very first point, which is getting the essentials back into the hands of the people. And I think the estimates, I could be wrong with these numbers, but the numbers that I've heard are that for the rest of the year, we need around $4 billion in terms of bridge financing. Shanta might be able to correct me if the numbers are not right, but that's the kind of number that we have heard. So where would this money come from? Definitely not from the IMF until the program is in place. And that program is going to take probably around 6 months, maybe a little longer. So we got to, and certainly not from the World Bank and the ADB, because all that will be connected to the IMF program. So the chances are that we will need to look at a few friendly countries who might then help us out in terms of the bridge financing. Now, the bridge financing can take different forms. It can be credit lines, it can be funding, stuff like this. But I think fundamentally it will need to come from a few friendly countries that look at Sri Lanka and realize that Sri Lanka needs short-term help and is willing to grant that help.
So, Suresh, talking about bridge financing, we're talking about friendly nations.
Yeah.
Who are the friendly nations that we can look at to provide us with the money? Because the Chinese ambassador has gone on record saying that it's sad that the Sri Lankan government went to the IMF and decided a default. And then you have the Indian government, which is pressing for Sri Lanka's reclassification as a lower income country temporarily for debt restructuring. So we are left with Japan, we are left with South Korea. our relationship with South Korea was tarnished because of the light railway project that was cancelled by the present government in play. And then Japan, we know the relationship that one of our former presidents had with the Japanese government, which is quite concrete at the moment. So which countries can we go to ask for this money? You're talking about around $3 to $4 billion.
Yeah, I think India has been particularly helpful. I believe they are making a case for us with the IMF as well, at least judging by the media. You're right. Japan is one of those countries that will hopefully will come forward to help. At the end of the day, Sri Lanka has maintained decent relationships with many countries, and that I think is a positive thing. And the chance, and so there may be other countries also that are willing to help, but clearly we see that the focus seems to be on India, and from what we are hearing, that there seems to be some focus on Japan and China as well. Yeah, what you were saying about the Chinese ambassador, yes, that came out was a little bit surprising, but it probably relates back to what Shanta was saying in terms of the underlying reasons why he said what he said. But I'm still confident, even where China is concerned, because we've had a long relationship with them. It goes back to the Rubber Ice Pact of the 1950s, I believe. So I'm hopeful that there will be countries that do come to Sri Lanka's aid. If they don't, we are in quite a bit of trouble. I mean, a lot more trouble than we are in now.
So let's say, Suresh, hypothetically, that these countries don't give us the required money that we're talking about, which is approximately around $3 to $4 billion US dollars, because we know for a fact that India has a reserve of over 500 billion US dollars. It's not that they want to give us the money just like that either. We know China has a lot of reserves as far as US dollars are concerned. It's not like China wants to give us the money. There's never a free lunch, they say.
Never a free lunch, yeah.
So given that fact, what happens if these countries don't come to our rescue, hypothetically? Where is Sri Lanka going to stand?
So the shortages will continue. It could get worse than what it is now. Today you got to be in a petrol queue, I don't know how many days before you manage to pump the petrol. Gas is tough to get, medicines are tough to get, power cuts are still around. So these things are likely to get worse before it gets better. And if the funding, if the bridge financing doesn't come, then we will have no choice, but we'll have to wait it out until IMF program is finalized and the other multilateral agencies come to our aid, and we can get back into the financial markets once a debt restructuring is also completed. So in the interim, if the bridge financing doesn't come through, I think the situation is going to get worse than it is now. So let's hope, let's be positive, and let's be optimistic, and let's hope that the bridge financing does come through. And I think I'm relatively confident it will happen.
Right. Suresh, you've been heading a few conglomerates during your time in Sri Lanka, and you are also the former chairman of the Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce. My question to you in particular revolves around the current protests that are taking place in the country. Most of these protesters are demanding that the government go home and ensure there is a new president or a new prime minister to steer the country in the right trajectory. In your opinion, as a business leader who's been in this game for a very, very long time, what is the real need of the hour right now? What must Sri Lankans start thinking about at this very moment of time?
Shamir, I think from a perspective of the protests, right, I think they're justified. At the end of the day, people don't have what they require for a normal life, right? I mean, we are short of power, we are short of fuel, medicines, gas. So I think the frustration, the anger, the desperation, I think this is all very justified. And I also believe that whilst it may be inconvenience. There may be inconvenience because of the protests in addition to the shortages. I think what the protests have done is that they've opened up a golden opportunity for Sri Lanka to take a new approach. You know, the system change that is being spoken about. And I think this is where we really need to focus on. And when I speak of a system change, I'm referring to should we look at a constitution that really serves the needs of the people? Do we put our governance systems in place? Do we get our systems and processes, you know, to prevent corruption, to make sure that law and order applies to everyone in an equitable manner, right, where people are treated equally? I think this is a golden opportunity to get all those governance frameworks into place, because we are seeing the politicians for once on the back foot, right? Now, I think that if we start getting our economy sorted out, 12 months down the road, I think the politicians will be back on the front foot. And once that happens, judging by past history, it's going to be impossible to get some of those changes done. So I think we've got this real golden opportunity at the moment, and I think civil society needs to come together, and that includes the business community. It includes the legal profession. It includes everyone, really. Civil society needs to come together to keep this pressure on until such time that we can get these governance structures and governance processes in place, so that fundamentally Sri Lankans don't need to depend on, you know, the goodness of the individual who sits in the highest chair, but instead can depend on the systems and processes to take the country forward.
Right. Thank you very much, Suresh Shah, former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to another former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, who is a celebrated senior banker, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja. Mr. Tyagaraja, interestingly, we spoke about this crisis not once, many a time. And you, alongside with Suresh, Mr. Vish Govindaswamy, several other past chairmen of Anureka Naika, past chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, all of you came on board and said debt restructuring is the way to go about as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. And this was prior to the government deciding to pay that $500 million in January as ISB payments. What went wrong?
So I guess what the 3 or 4 of us who sat in this same panel, and along with several others, using objective evidence and rationale, said the same thing, one common thing. But I guess it did not, the option did not go into the right ears, and obviously people thought otherwise. And I think a number of us who took that view were of the view that the markets had already factored in the situation we were in, so that by paying that 500 million, or even by looking at the next billion, we were not going to gain anything materially upside to increase the risk profile of the country. And given that there was already an identified shortage looming of essentials, starting with fuel, the argument was to use that valuable, scarce foreign reserves for what was needed for the people of the country rather than somebody outside.
Mr. Tyagaraja, who do you point the finger at?
So obviously it will have to be the people who were irresponsible for taking the decision whether or not, a couple of things, in terms of the administration of the monetary policy of the country, in particular about how to defend the foreign exchange, manage the foreign exchange reserves. That was on one point. The second issue was, during this period, continuously, we saw the philosophy of money being printed. And today, I believe, over the last 27 months, we have seen approximately 40 or 41% increase in the stock of new money being printed, while the net increase in the real economic growth was around 1%. So the question has to be asked, for what purpose was this printed, and who was held responsible for managing that curtailment of that expenditure. And again, looking forward, one of the fundamental issues with all these discussions and negotiations is, do we as a nation and the government have what it takes, the discipline even going forward, to address some of these things? Because going to the IMF alone is not going to resolve the medium-term problem which Sri Lanka has got, which is addressing the rebounding of the real sector. So that discipline has to come in.
So, Mr. Agaraja, you say that those who decide on the monetary policy of the country should be held accountable and responsible for the current predicament that we are in as a nation. I just want to drag your attention to a few months back, Mr. Agaraja, when the former governor of the central bank decided to step down from his position as the governor of the central bank. When there was no way out for the country, he decided to throw the towel and go off the radar. So, given that fact, there are two members who still remain in the monetary board who were there back then. So, we are talking about an independent central bank. We are talking about the governance structure to be good and well. So, do you think we can expect anything better even from the authorities now, because we have two members who sat in the monetary board of the central bank back then, prior to this situation, and we have them sitting in the monetary board even now?
So there are two aspects to that. One thing is the subject of the independence of the central bank, which has been a subject of discussion just not in the last few months. I think there were many economists and people in think tanks who have been bringing this up for years. And Sri Lanka is not the only case of getting into an independence of the central bank. If I may quote, if you really look at what they call the central bank independence index, there is a independent gauge of this. And if one looks at the 25 years from 1980 to 2015, what was 12% of the sample of central banks which were deemed to be independent in 1980 has increased to as high as 81% in 2015. So the philosophy and the principle of independence has been well accepted in most of the member countries of the IMF. But Sri Lanka, I think there was a window of opportunity during the previous government when I believe the current governor, under his chairmanship, the Monetary Law Act was reviewed, and I believe that a document was presented or got ready to be presented to Parliament, which actually enshrined this very issue of independence. But for some reason, when things changed in 2019, it was shelved. It was not brought up. So I don't think we need to really go back. All we have to do is to pull that from the shelves and go forward. But if we take the second issue as to the remaining composition, the members who are still there, I know one member had already resigned. When one sits in a committee, one has the right to express his thoughts or her thoughts independently. Even though it may be collective, they have their right. And if there was a belief that people, experienced people who had the knowledge and experience that we were going in the wrong path and this MMT or the modern monetary theory of printing money was not going to contribute towards the economic process, then those people should have thought of resigning at that time.
Right. So when we go back to the past, Mr. Agaraja, John Exter, the founding governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, has very clearly outlined that an individual whose integrity is questioned cannot serve as a governor of the central bank as well. So moving on, Mr. Agaraja, with regard to the policy interest rates that was increased recently by 7 basis points. What I don't understand, or what I'm finding difficult to comprehend at the moment, is the fact that our policy interest rates, our fixed deposits are going at 14.5%. However, our treasury bills are going at 24%. What's going on?
So what typically tends to happen, I'm sure others may also endorse this, is depending on economic cycles, when the interest rate regime tends to go up, the main player in the economic or the financial services sector in Sri Lanka, which happens to be banks more than anybody else, they tend to fast track the interest rates on the lending side, but on the deposit sides they tend to be a bit more shy. Whereas on the other side, when the interest rate flips on the other side, it does the reverse. So I think that's the phenomena we are currently seeing. But in addition to that happening, the central bank, I think, took the decision to allow market forces to play in the pricing of the treasury bills and treasury bonds, which then saw the instruments spiking from the near 10-11% to 15-16 and now into the mid-20s. While obviously the 7% policy hike may have to some extent curtailed an arbitrage opportunity for the banking sector to go to the window of last resort, borrow at cheap and place, which was happening before. I believe the current readjustment will, obviously, the gap will probably narrow over the coming weeks and months as free market forces continue to play.
Thank you very much.
But it probably came a bit too late.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Tagwaj, senior banker and former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I stand to be corrected on this occasion in terms of the light rail project. It was to be implemented by the Japanese government, Japanese International Cooperation Agency, or JICA. I mentioned it was South Korea. It's not South Korea, it's JICA, the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. I open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate right is Nadim Majid. On to my immediate left is Deshan Gonavala. Let's start off with Deshan.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shamir. I think I want to start off with Mr. Tyagaraja himself. Mr. Tyagaraja, since we were on the topic of the central bank, its independence and the role it can play, particularly in the context of now recovering from the problems we are facing, a prominent economist, Steve Hanker, has over the last few weeks reiterated that his stance is that if Sri Lanka wants to seriously curtail the effects of runaway inflation, and also to look at potentially stabilizing the budget and the external liabilities as well, that they need to look at abandoning the central bank altogether and putting in place a currency board. How realistic is this, and what pros and drawbacks do you think this will have in terms of Sri Lanka coming from the crisis it is currently facing, and whether it is even remotely politically viable in the volatile context that it is in right now?
So as far as my limited knowledge is aware, in I think the world, especially in this part of the world, the one who introduced the currency board was Malaysia a few years ago, maybe a couple of decades ago. Maybe the environment was quite different. But I personally do not believe that there is a case to replace central banking when there is a very well established structure put in place. All one needs to do is to give it the right sort of independence. And I mean, having been in the game for almost 30 years here, I have worked very closely with several of the people who were in the past as well as currently serving leadership positions there, and I have the highest respect for the professionals there, as long as they're given the independence to perform. I think Sri Lanka is in good hands and they will come out. But it's very important that the role of the central bank is to focus on monetary policy and not to, they must have a clear understanding of fiscal, but that influence has to be separate. Our neighbor, India, went through the same problem till the early 90s. But I think it was Manmohan Singh, I think during that era, when we had that famous shipment of gold to the Bank of England, when they had to actually mortgage gold to get out of a crisis, from stemming from that problem, they actually institutionalized and by statute separated the two, and see where India is today.
Mr. Thiagaraja, I think we also need to make it clear that Mr. Steve Hanke of the Cato Institute, a well-known libertarian institute, while he might have his ideas on Sri Lanka's inflation and currency boards, in order to have a currency board, you must have sufficient reserves of foreign currency.
Absolutely.
I'd like to pose a more focused question to both of you, since we have two former chairpersons of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce here today, which is regarding rent-seeking businesses, because there's been a lot of discussion in the backdrop of the Aragale about the role that the private sector has played in bringing Sri Lanka to this position. And that is not a role that can be downplayed. We've seen, if you look at what we would normally consider that your business magazines, etc., would put forward as the most successful or the most industrious, the most entrepreneurial businesses in the country are no more than rent seekers. They're not actually entrepreneurial. They're preventing any kind of competition from happening, and they end up being rent seekers. Do you feel that, both of you, given your time as chairpersons of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, do you feel that the chamber itself has done enough to represent the voice of business in Sri Lanka and not just the rent seekers?
You will take that.
What do you mean when you say rent seekers in the context of the business community?
People who are running monopolistic businesses by preventing any kind of competition from coming.
Should I take it?
Yeah, go ahead. But
okay. Let me...
I mean, Shamir can probably attest to it in the tea industry, for example.
So let me start and Suresh can follow that. So I think it's all relative. If you look at the role of not just the Ceylon Chamber, but chambers themselves, at different points in time of the country's evolution, they play a different role. But the role keeps on evolving, and I don't think one can ever say status quo, that once you reach a particular point of contribution, you have done enough. I think one needs to keep on pushing yourself beyond the bar. And I think at this point in time, the bar has really gone up, and I think it has to continue to go. The issue, I think, for the chamber is, I think all of us, when we took on this role as chamber chairman, we subscribed to a principle of 10 principles. And I think in that, as far as we are concerned, I can say that I'm sure Suresh will say the same thing. During our tenure, the country and industrial issues came before individual businesses. When we came in and sat there, we never brought in a particular company issue into the table. If it related to the industry as a whole, it came into advocacy. And I think, yes, there is, in my opinion, chambers in general, I think could have done much more to bring attention, and also, with, as Suresh said, with civil society, because this window of opportunity has now brought everyone together.
Mr. Thiagaraja, last week on Face the Nation, we had Dr. Nicholas, if I'm not mistaken, and he was talking about the last major push towards industrialization in Sri Lanka. Well, the policies were laid during the Premadasa Senior presidency, and we're still sort of reaping the fruits of those policies, according to, if I'm not mistaken, according to what he said. And he did, in a sense, articulate that the reason that we haven't gone beyond that, there hasn't been further industrialization is because of rent-seeking industries, rent-seeking businesses.
So I would slightly rephrase that. I would say more than rent-seeking, I would say maybe we have historically, Suresh can correct me, but I think in my opinion, we have been historically as businesses following the policy of governments rather than pushing for advocacy to push what the industry wants.
But Suresh, can we say that, I mean, recently we saw, not recently, but like during the investigation into the bond scam, it came to light that the General Secretary of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, and he's admitted this himself, Mr. Dayasiri Jayasekara, that he took a cash check for R1 million, if I'm not mistaken, from a company that was at the center of, or a subsidiary that was at the center of this investigation. So that is a microcosm of the role that the private sector plays in campaign finances, political financing in Sri Lanka. So can we really say that Sri Lanka is, that business is following politicians, or that politicians are following businesses?
No, we'll get back to that in a bit, but I just want to quickly...
Can I respond to Nadeem for a bit? Yeah, okay. So see, how I see this, Nadeem, is that really I think the private sector does respond to the policy environment in the country. Right now, that policy environment can be both official policy and also unofficial policy, right? And I think a lot of this stems from the fact that the private sector and the government both, and not one government but every government, right, defines protection, okay, in a way that prevents competition. Whereas I believe that protection needs to come from a private sector that is both competitive and productive. Right? A private sector that has the ability not just to fight within Sri Lanka, but to fight outside Sri Lanka. But because in the broader scheme of things, the Sri Lankan economy being so small needs to be an export-centric economy. Right? So our entire private sector needs to be productive and competitive. Right? But over the years, because of the policies that have been followed, the private sector has got used to getting protection by building walls around it. Right? And because our system is such, and this is why I was going back, I go back to what I said earlier, we've got this real golden opportunity to change the system. The system has been that the politician in power has the ability to, with the stroke of a pen, to change things to the detriment of the private sector, to the detriment of individual companies, right? And this is one of the reasons why even the chambers are finding it difficult to come out and speak out in the open about things that they should speak out. And I think the current crisis is a very good example of this. The chamber should have raised their voice at least a year ago, found ways of communicating the emerging environment and warning the government that things were going to get really tough. But they didn't, right? They didn't. Why? Because the politicians have so much power over individual businesses. Now, which is, so I go back to that earlier point that I made. We've got this fabulous opportunity to change the system, to change the governance system in the country that impacts not just business but practically everything, so that we reduce the influence of the politician to do some of these crazy things, right?
So, Professor Shant Devarajan, member of the Advisory Committee on Debt, joining us via Zoom today. Professor, interestingly, Sri Lanka, India has pressed for Sri Lanka's reclassification as a lower income country temporarily for debt restructuring. How do you view this statement by India, especially the finance minister, who said that the reclassification will help the country get more multilateral help to tide over the unprecedented financial crisis it is facing? Would that really help?
Actually, this is the first time I'm hearing that statement. But let me tell you what I think may be part of the reason for it, is that the G20, that's the group of 20 countries, which includes India, China, and as well as the G7, have developed something called a common framework for restructuring debt, which is only for low-income countries. And they've used it actually in the case of Zambia, Ethiopia, and Chad, I believe. But the case of Sri Lanka is Sri Lanka is a lower middle income country at the moment, but the case of Sri Lanka seems quite ripe for something like the common framework, because the common framework provides a platform that brings China and India in with the traditional Paris Club creditors, which were the G7 countries essentially. And this common framework could be very useful in negotiating the debt restructuring. And so I think one of the things behind the minister's statement is if we can reclassify Sri Lanka as a low-income country, they would be eligible for the common framework. And then that would make it easier to negotiate with all of the official creditors, including China and India, alongside the US and Japan and UK, than it would be if you had to do those negotiations separately.
Professor, was this one of the highlights during your conversations with the Minister of Finance in Sri Lanka and the Secretary of the Treasury, as well as the Governor of the Central Bank as well, about reclassification of Sri Lanka as a lower income country?
No, we didn't discuss this when they were here in Washington. But we did discuss the common framework. That's why I'm thinking that we discussed ways in which Sri Lanka could make use of the common framework. Frankly, the discussions we had were more like, could we get the G20 to make an exception in the case of Sri Lanka and accept a lower middle income country to be in the common framework, whereas it was originally designed for low income countries. But another way to do that is to reclassify Sri Lanka as a low income country.
So when we speak about the Paris Club, Professor, you spoke about the Paris Club as well. Going to the Paris Club, because we know in 2001, the Iraqi government back then, right after the war on terrorism, got a huge chunk of money to resurrect the country's economy in 2001. That was one of the casing points where the Paris Club really came to the help of a nation. And as a result of that, Iraq was able to at least raise its head above the water and make sure that they were in the right trajectory in terms of growth subsequent to the US invasion in Iraq. Do you think they would come to rescue Sri Lanka as well in the longer term?
Well, the Paris Club is for debt restructuring. That's their mandate. And the case, the problem with Sri Lanka going to the Paris Club is, I mean, perfectly fine, is that some of their biggest creditors are not members of the Paris Club, including India and China. Yes, you can go to the Paris Club, but that's not going to solve the debt, the unsustainable debt problem until you can bring China and India into that network.
Because this was a statement that was made by the Minister of Finance, Ali Sabri, as well, saying that they would seek the assistance of the Paris Club as well to revive the country's economy. So you mean to say that this is not going to be easy as the Minister of Finance predicts or forecasts?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to go beyond the Paris Club. There's nothing wrong with going to the Paris Club, but you need to go beyond that if you want to really make a significant difference to the debt restructuring.
Right. So Udara, interestingly, if you look at the way in which how debt is being restructured at the moment, the government announced that RFPs would be put out, and they were looking at individuals or companies to come and assist Sri Lanka in the debt restructuring program or the process. Do you think even this process that was adopted at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka in terms of its release that it was issued was transparent and coherent in terms of finding the right people for the job? Are they looking for Sri Lankans or are they looking for overseas players? What sort of people are they looking at?
So the documents I've seen, the official release from the Ministry of Finance, list certain tasks that they expect to be done. It's not really clear beyond this exactly how they would be used, how they would fit in with the advisory committee that's already there, how they would fit in with the central bank. So it's kind of, it seems as if it's asking for established institutions or consultancies, but looking at the document itself, it's a little bit difficult to understand what exactly.
So given that fact, now we are in a very precarious situation. We are in a dilemma. We have already declared bankruptcy. We are in a very complex situation in terms of the country's economy. My question to you is, Udara, do you see any heroes in Sri Lanka? Because in 1991, Dr. Manmohan Singh was able to resurrect the country's economy. India was finding it very difficult to find means in terms of US dollars and so on and so forth. But today, India has a reserve of 500 billion US dollars. Do you see any heroes in Sri Lanka who will do this for us?
I mean, Manmohan Singh was handpicked because there was a political will in order to allow him to implement these reforms. And in a sense, the reforms he did were much more difficult than what is needed in Sri Lanka right now. What I would say is we need to think beyond individuals and heroes. I think it was mentioned before that we really need to think about the systems that we have in place. Because we can have somebody we consider a hero, but if the system is bad, that's, in the end, we have no control over the final outcome.
Udar, I want to talk to you about this search for heroes, because one of the things that when you look at the coverage of the Sri Lankan economic crisis, and the multiple crises that have emanated from that, you do get the sense that we have lost agency. Because if you look at it from, I'm not a fan of the whole East-West dichotomy, but if you look at it from the perspective of the Indian and Western media, it's because of a Chinese debt trap. If you look at it from the perspective of Chinese state media or Eastern media, for want of a better word, it's because we have continuously been going to the IMF and these programs have failed us. But the reality is that we have, not just this government, we have actively governed ourselves into this position. And that is the reality, isn't it? Because Shamir referred earlier to what the Chinese ambassador had said. But maybe the Chinese ambassador has forgotten that back in January, we requested China to restructure our debt. And they refused.
No, they didn't refuse nothing. That's wrong. We changed our stance. We said that we were going for debt restructuring with the Chinese foreign minister, but then the governor of the central bank... The Chinese foreign minister in his press conference said, we will continue to support, this is basically diplomatic doublespeak for we're not going to do anything extra. And when you see what the ambassador is saying now, that is really crocodile tears, isn't it? Or dragon tears.
I don't really want to speculate on what the ambassador is saying, but what I would say is that I think part of the reason we've gotten this far down the track is that the situation has been described really as a currency crisis or a dollar crisis. And I've said this before, it's not a dollar crisis, it's what's called a twin deficits crisis, which is current account crisis, and a fiscal crisis, a general fiscal crisis. And this fiscal side is something which really, there's always talk about government corruption, mismanagement, but if you look at just the size of the state is enormous in Sri Lanka. So we talked about the capture of businesses. The size of government spending is 20% of GDP. The size of government bonds on commercial bank balance sheets is 40%. Right? So essentially the private sector is very much a tiny fraction of the country. The country is basically a state player with the private sector trying to navigate within this smaller space. So whatever reforms we have, we need to deal with the size of the government, and we need to reduce this, and we need to deal with the footprint that the state has. And a lot of these issues we talk about, corruption or mismanagement, they have such a big effect on the economy because the state is so big. And until we deal with this, we won't be able to move forward. And the first step really is to deal with the stock of debt that we have overall. We're dealing with the external stock of debt with the committee in Washington, and we'll do some restructuring ultimately there. But we need to also deal with the domestic debt issue. And dealing with the domestic issue will go hand in hand with reducing the size of the state.
Yeah, but what I don't understand is, Udara, now let's look at printing money, which was pointed out by Mr. Tyagaraja and Suresh as well. So now we have gone to the World Bank to help us buy fertilizer for $700 million US. And then we make a political statement in the political fora by the government. The president and the prime minister both have said that they would give the fertilizer that we are buying from the World Bank at a subsidy to the people. What does it really mean? Are we really genuine in our efforts? We are in this mess because of problems that have been created by politicians. And aren't we digging our own grave yet again?
Absolutely. So the size of the state subsidies is definitely a big drain on the government. But we don't want to suddenly go from having huge subsidies and huge state benefits to nothing, because that's going to disrupt people's lives immensely. What we do need to do is to go from state institutions and state subsidies down to the bare minimum which is necessary for to create a decent social safety net. And this means the discussion we really need to be having is the state-owned enterprises, what we're doing with those, how we can make them efficient, because the subsidies we give for farmers and we give for education and for food, these and for fuel even, these are necessities. But if you look at the state-owned enterprise and the drain on the budget, this is far more significant than what we're giving for basic necessities.
So Suresh, now interestingly, we are with the IMF. Now, majority of the people are of the opinion that this is our savior. They are here. We can think of a great future. Everything is going to be hunky-dory in a few months from now. This is not the case, is it?
So I'll first start by responding a little bit to the question that Nadeem put to Udara as well. Don't blame China, don't blame the West, don't blame India, don't blame the people who gave you the loans, right? I mean, at the end of it, we took the loans, okay? And we got to ask ourselves, why did we take the loans? Did we take the loans? Should we have taken the loans? Did we take it for the right reasons? And I think Udara was very correct when he said that the loans were taken because of the twin deficits, right? So this applies to what you just asked me, Shamir. It's not the IMF that's going to come on the white horse and save us. They are not the knight in the shining armor. I think at the end of the day, we need to have the economic plan that takes the country out of trouble. And based on the economic plan, if the economic plan is sensible, then the IMF will give us some assistance to help us through, right? So let's not look for people outside Sri Lanka to come and be our savior. We need to save ourselves, right? And part and parcel of that process of saving ourselves is putting the right economic plan in place. Like Udara said, there is, you can't suddenly make changes because it's going to cause disruptions to people's lives. So you've got to take this in stages. We need assistance during the transition period. That's where people like the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB, the friendly countries will come in. But fundamentally, these are the things that we got to do. The economic plan, putting the governance systems in place, like I said earlier, right. All these things, we need to do these things. And I go back to the point that I made earlier. The politicians have failed us, right? For 70 years, the politicians have failed us. This government, the last government, the previous government, every one of them. Okay? So we've got this opportunity because there is so much pressure on the politicians at the moment. We should not let that opportunity go. So let's not look at people outside Sri Lanka to help us and save us. I think we need to do it for ourselves.
So, Mr. Tyagaraja, interestingly, the strain on the banking sector in the country, how has that affected the country's banking sector? Because we know 13 banks was downgraded by Fitch and they've been put on the watch list. Now the people are scared to go and invest their money at local banks.
And even the insurance companies.
And this is a very big strain. How do you view this, Mr. Agaraja?
So the downgrading of those banks would have been a reflection of the sovereign downgrading, which is a world-established methodology. It is not unique to Sri Lanka. But the issue with not really the downgrading, but with what we are currently going through, as Udara mentioned, I'm just going to take you to a slightly back to the importance of appointing the right sort of advisor here, because that's very relevant today, because we are only speaking today about this component of external debt, which is, as at end of December 2021, roughly 37% of the total country's debt, right? And then Shanta, somewhere I think earlier in his comments, alluded to the principle of equitable treatment of creditors, right? So when you look at the principle of equity, it's not only on one class, whether it's foreign, it can apply across the whole gamut. So when you appoint an advisor is absolutely important. This is the first time Sri Lanka is going through this. We are not Argentina. So we need to make sure that we select through a good process a firm or a group of advisors who have already got credible and demonstrable track record of guiding governments, working on behalf of governments in these complex negotiations. That's the first point I would like to make, Shamil. Secondly, when we get into that space, this whole issue with external debt is one subject to be discussed because of the foreign problem we have. But as Udara said, it's not a foreign problem. It's a problem of twin deficits. And then as Suresh said, one of the issues in addressing the twin deficit is you need to have a sustainable plan, but the sustainable plan has to be followed with definitely a series of policy reforms, which will also include domestic austerity. Domestic austerity is absolutely going to be important. Banks come into that place. So when we look at the banks, I know Nadeem mentioned about the insurance, because a lot of the captive funds have invested money into government securities and deposits. Banks themselves have a reasonably significant portfolio of domestic securities at the moment. We'll come to loan side separately. On the investment side, now with currently what is happening with the treasury bills rates going beyond 20%, naturally the price of the instruments have also plummeted, gone down. And I'm not sure how each bank is treating it, but there are three, depending on which they add up, either they will take the hit to the P&L using mark-to-market, or they will take it through the balance sheet, through the equity reserve. Either way, there is going to be a stress, either in terms of dividend payouts and sustainability of the business model on one side. Secondly, also we have to bear in mind, even if they take it through the equity reserve, it's going to affect on the capital structure of these banks, which also gets into compliance and requirements. The third point with this is, remember, we also have, especially for the listed banks, a significant component of ownership with non-Sri Lankan funds and investors who have already put in their money, and now they are faced with an investment in a depreciating currency. So again, just let me finish. So looking at further infusion to support these banks, there is going to be multiple challenges at this moment in time. That's on one side, on the liability side. On the asset side, when we look at the loan portfolios at this moment in time, I see two or three big chunks to be concerned about.
Right.
First is, if we look at the big burning thing which started in 2019 with the moratoriums, you had three phases on the general pandemic moratoriums, which ended, I think, in December last year or March last year. And the repayments have just started. But my feedback is, I think January and February were probably good months. But in March, with the current situation and then also with what is happening outside there, people, genuine borrowers with the genuine intent of wanting to repay are also finding it difficult now because their production, their sources of income have got stalled because there is no gas, no whatever is happening. So even genuine intent is going to get challenged. So we'll see the results in the coming months.
Should the domestic clients of these banks, all of the banks that have been placed on what you call rating watch negative, that's basically us, Sri Lankan citizens, Sri Lankan nationals, should we be worried about the health of the banking sector?
Naturally,
is there potential for collapse?
It's not a question of being overly panicking, but I think we need to be aware of these things. The second point I will bear in mind, one was the moratorium sector. Then you have almost, I'm told, about 550 billion worth of, I'm told, subject to July 21 figures, of the tourist sector related moratorium loans, which are going to come up now, I think, towards the middle or end of 2022. Time will tell whether those industries are able to repay those loans, which are in bank balance sheets. Then on the other side, the banks genuinely, I think, went out to support the power generation sector and supported a lot of large power projects, private power projects, based on power purchase agreements of the SOE. And I'm told, subject to correction, that there is a 6 or 7 month non-payment of some of those dues, which is definitely going to stress banks' lending portfolios. And these are just two examples of big chunks in these balance sheets, which will have to be looked. The third issue which we have to bear in mind, which I think is now starting to loom, with the foreign exchange problem, with the country limits all being shrunk, we have some of these banks, again subject to correction, and towards some of the bigger banks, which entered into some of these counterparty foreign funding arrangements, some of these SOEs, then had to go into the local banking systems on short-term swaps, even at a premium. And I'm told that now some of those swap agreements are coming for maturity, where the ability of some of these counterparties are finding it difficult to actually meet those commitments. So these sort of challenges will naturally have a rebounding effect in the coming weeks and months if we as a nation don't look at domestic debt as well and just only focusing on external debt. I think we need to, in my personal opinion, like Udana, I think we need to look at the whole picture and not only part of the picture.
Right. So, Professor Devarajan, interesting thoughts by Suresh as well as Mr. Tyagaraja and Udara with regard to the problems that we're facing at present. I want to bring to your attention conditions that are conducive for long-term economic growth with regard to the establishment of good governance, observance of the rule of law, maintenance of law and order, the promotion of health institutional setup in Sri Lanka, which was articulated by Suresh in his opening remarks. How important are these for economic recovery?
They're absolutely the most important factors that determine the economic growth of a country. But the reason for it, and that's why if I could elaborate a little bit on what Suresh was saying, the reason for it is that these features, good governance, the rule of law, checks and balances in the system, are the ones that lead to good policies. See, we've been in the business of advising countries on good policy, on policies for economic growth and inclusion and so on. But what we find is that no matter how good the technical advice is, some countries, and Sri Lanka might be one of them, don't seem to adopt these good policies. And in fact, sometimes they adopt bad policies. And the reason for that is the governance, that there are people, very powerful people, who have captured the government, who have good links with the government, who stand to gain from bad policies. That's why we've allowed a whole set of distortionary policies, horrible distortionary policies. And I would include in that things like the Paddy Lands Act and subsequent trade policies, labor regulations, and even Samurdhi, which is supposed to be a social protection program, which only reaches about 50% of the poor and about 50% of those who get it, aren't poor, as examples of where bad governance can lead to poor policies and then undermine growth and inclusion. So I think what Suresh said is absolutely right. It's fundamental because it enables a policy environment that's conducive to economic growth.
So, Professor, interestingly, biting the bullet, we've had many economists on this very show over the last few weeks who spoke about the IMF reform agenda and what sort of agendas that needs to be presented to the IMF before we go in and discuss with them. In your opinion, what is a good deal with the IMF? How does it look like?
I think that's the wrong question, to be frank. The real question is, what's a good deal for Sri Lanka? Let's first talk about that. And what's a good deal for Sri Lanka in the current situation is, on the one hand, a debt restructuring so that the total amount of debt that needs to be paid back is lowered in present value terms. And the second is fiscal adjustment. You know, we've been talking about this in this conversation about the twin deficit. Well, the real deficit is the fiscal deficit. That's the original sin. And it's important to recognize that when the Rajapaksa government cut taxes in 2019, they cut the VAT rate by 7 percentage points. 2 months later, the credit agencies downgraded Sri Lanka's credit rate to near default levels. This was before COVID and everything else. So the creditors, the credit rating agencies, and therefore the creditors, are watching the fiscal deficit. So if we want to get out of this mess, we really have to do something about the fiscal deficit. Udar is right that the level of public expenditure is 20% of GDP, but the other side of that is the level of revenues is 8% of GDP, one of the lowest in the world. So what is good for Sri Lanka is to increase the tax revenues, and then there are a whole bunch of unproductive expenditures in the budget that should be eliminated. And somebody mentioned Sri Lankan Airlines, which is another classic example. I think Sri Lankan Airlines consumes about 0.8% of GDP by itself. He tells you how big the hole that they're running is, not to mention the fact that it might threaten the banking system as well.
Professor Devarajan?
But there are other state-owned enterprises that require reform. So these are the components of a fiscal adjustment. Now, just let me say one other thing that is important to keep in mind is that when you undertake a fiscal adjustment of this type, you have to protect the poor. That has to be fundamental. And a system of targeted cash transfers, and better targeted than Samurthi, is absolutely necessary as part of this transfer.
Professor Devarajan, I do not know whether you have got yourself acclimatized with the current political thoughts that are going around these days. A lot of political tug of war in Sri Lanka in terms of who needs to be the prime minister, who needs to be the president, so on and so forth. But there was a notion that was presented by the opposition in parliament stating that a new budget needs to be presented in parliament to discuss ways in which to give relief to the people. Do you think this is a prudent decision at this moment of time?
Absolutely, but it's what I was just saying. I think, look, these people on the streets are angry, and they're angry because of the shortages that they have experienced, and it's been horrible, right? To not be able to get medicines, not be able to get food, not be able to get gasoline and power cuts and so on, right? Now, the good thing is that they put the blame for these shortages squarely in the face of economic policies. They understand the link between bad economic policies and the suffering that they're going through now. This is actually a huge advantage because I have to spend in other countries, I have to spend a lot of time having to explain this to people. But now these people get it, the ones on Gulf-Face Green, right? So in that situation, we have to now make the adjustments, the fiscal adjustments I was just describing, in order to get out of this mess. But you can actually explain to the people that if these bad policies got you into this situation, then one way to get out of the situation requires reversing those policies, undoing the unproductive subsidies, getting rid of Sri Lankan Airlines, and raising taxes. Now, all of those can be seen as austerity in an objective sense, but I think people who've seen what those bad policies have got them into today will recognize that we need to change them in the opposite direction if we want to make any progress. Again, emphasizing that we have to protect the poor, the bottom 40% of the population, because they are in even worse straits than the others, and an increase in the price of fuel or the price of electricity can be devastating to them. So in all countries that do these fiscal adjustments now, they accompany it with targeted cash transfers to the poor, and Sri Lanka can do it. So I think what the opposition party was proposing is feasible if you can do it in this way. And I think we have an opportunity to do it because the people recognize that it was...
Professor, I may probably ask you a political question, if I may ask you a political question now. There is a prime minister in the country. We're talking about the 21st Amendment to the Constitution to come into play as well. In your opinion, do you think a change of regime at this point of time is the way out for Sri Lanka? A new prime minister, a new cabinet, is that the way out for Sri Lanka?
That's really not for me to decide. That's for the people of Sri Lanka to decide. I really honestly don't have an opinion on that because I don't think that's my purview. But I would say one thing, because I keep getting asked this question by other journalists as well, which is, does a change in regime affect the IMF program, or the success of the IMF program? And that I would say, we have been cognizant that there might be a change in regime, and we have been looking at what possibilities there are to maintain the same program that we are negotiating all the way till the end. And most people are very open to that, including the fund. And there have been precedent where in previous cases, such as in Korea, where the IMF started negotiating a program and there was a change of government and the new government actually signed the program. And I think, since we've already had discussions with the opposition leaders over the last 3 or 4 months, and they basically endorsed the program that we're working on, I think there's a good chance that whoever is in charge when the program is negotiated will endorse the program. So there is some assurance that whether there is a change in regime or not, we will be able to negotiate the fiscal adjustment with the IMF in the way that would be in Sri Lanka's best interest.
Professor Devarajan, about the fiscal adjustment, I think one of the key considerations that you do have to consider is that if you look at the real cost of living in Sri Lanka, for example, it has really shot up with the depreciation of the rupee and the shortages, the price hikes, the inflation, the works. What you did mention was cash grants to the poorest of the poor as a means through which we can potentially offset this. But given also the nature of our fiscal discipline here at home in the local economy, in the domestic economy also being wanting, added to that also in terms of the liabilities and all that overseas with regard to the debt and the foreign currency issues, how realistic is it that we can create a program that can have the right social buy-in? Because as you mentioned, these are not short-term fixes. This requires a degree of sacrifice over a certain period of time. And with the quality of life deteriorating to the extent it has, and potentially having to take on a few more haircuts in the coming months, how realistic is it that the people can handle this kind of economic repercussions of macro instability rather? And also going beyond that, if you put a timeline on it, there are plenty of countries that have faced similar issues that have taken a number of years or even a decade to stabilize. In this context, what kind of answer can you give to the question on what the people of Sri Lanka can expect in terms of moving forward into the next year to 3 years at least?
Okay, I would say two things. One is, there's no question cost of living has gone up 20, 30%. People are suffering from that, not to mention the shortages as well. But we have to ask the question, why did the cost of living go up? Why has inflation been so high in Sri Lanka? And we know that behind it all is the fiscal deficit. It's not just the fiscal deficit, although the fiscal deficit is 10, 11% of GDP, but the central bank decided to finance that fiscal deficit by printing money, as several people on this panel have been saying, right? And that is why we have such high inflation. So one thing that we have to tell people is that if we can reduce the fiscal deficit, inflation will come down. That is a way of actually making it easier for people to live their lives. Right. And there's plenty of evidence around the world of countries that have run into this kind of situation where they undertook steps to cut the fiscal deficit, and that brought inflation down. And we have to keep that perspective in mind. So even though there might be, somebody's taxes might go up, it actually could lead to lower inflation. And inflation, remember, is also a huge tax on the poor. So because their incomes are usually not indexed to inflation, and they don't have very many assets. So this is the same thing. It's trying to get people. But I think the other important point to keep in mind is that economic policy in Sri Lanka, historically, as I said, from the Paddy Lands Act to all the trade policies, to the social protection policies, to the tax policies, to the labor policies, they have all been discriminating against the poor. And they have, therefore, in favor of the rich. The non-poor in Sri Lanka have benefited from a whole series of economic policies at the expense of the poor. This is the chance to reverse that. We have to make sure that going forward, the economic policies will be geared in such a way that the poor will benefit. And the way to do that doesn't require that the rich, who have been benefiting from all of these distortionary policies in the past, have to take a hit. So they have to increase taxes on them, and they have to cut subsidies on goods and services that rich people consume in much larger numbers than the poor. And that's the reality of it. And we have to put that in place. And I really think the poor, the people on the street in Gulf-Ace Green actually understand this. Some politicians may not, and they may object to this, saying, oh, well, the people will resist. But I have a feeling this is a unique moment in the history of Sri Lanka where the people actually understand what needs to be done, and maybe some politicians don't.
Mr. Agrawal, interesting. I was talking to you about treasury bills before, and it's getting a 1-year treasury bill gets a yield of approximately 24% right now. Would there be a situation where the government may take a haircut on treasury bills in the future?
It all depends on how they recognize the need to look and manage domestic debt as part of the overall debt restructure. One cannot leave that, one cannot be complacent and say our problem is Forex and let's focus on foreign. One has to also condition itself that there may, this conversation may get into as part of the negotiations, and the government has to prepare itself as to how it would defend its story if it wants to keep the domestic debt out of that story. And if it doesn't have a viable story, then naturally the domestic debt will open itself to that sort of challenge.
So there is a risk of the government taking a haircut, and as a result, the people who have invested their hard-earned money will lose it.
So it is, again, I'm only talking from the principle of equality
Right.
in terms of treatment. Just one point which I know I should have touched during the point of this emergency bridging financing, where different options were discussed.
Right.
I think we spoke about the difficulty and the 4 billion. But maybe there is one silver lining, in my personal opinion, which is may not be 4 billion, it may be 1 or 2 billion, is why at this moment in time, the country is ranked credit poor from a ratings point of view. But I think we still have an extremely good story of promoting how rich we are from a climate perspective. Today, if we look at the twin elements of the terrestrial nature, Sri Lanka, I believe, is having the highest in terms of biodiversity in Asia on one side. And then secondly, we claim to have an ocean reserve which is 8 times that of the landmass. And today, again, while we speak about negotiating with multinationals and bilaterals for emergency, one aspect is to ask them for handouts. But there's another way of doing this, to look at their benevolence and goodwill, friendly as Suresh said. Some of them may be willing to lend their credibility and creditworthiness to enhance the credit profile, where we may be able to leverage the nature richness of this country, which is not reflected in the national rupee cents balance sheet. This may be a first for Sri Lanka to see whether we can harness nature-linked funding, which may not have restricted use for this purpose. Right. And that is something which I think the government should, with the advice of the likes of Shanta, Indrajit and various people, should explore as a part of that whole repository of choices.
Right. So Suresh, interestingly, right after the government or the governor decided to freeze debt servicing, this has also had some ripple effects in the manufacturing industries in Sri Lanka as well. Many suppliers are not offering goods to Sri Lanka on LCs for new raw material supplies, and they want confirmed LCs. How do you think going forward, right now in this current situation, how difficult is it going to be to source funds and make sure that we are able to get goods from our suppliers on debt?
So, Shamir, the difficulties were felt long before the governor issued, before the central bank issued that statement and stopped the debt servicing. I think now the path is a lot clearer than it was, say, 2 or 3 months ago, right? Now everyone knows we are going into debt restructuring. The world knows that we are going in for an IMF program. So there is a lot more clarity, there is a lot more certainty. I think from that perspective, although you will continue to see in the short term some difficulties that the companies might face. There might be difficulties in terms of imports, but I think it will start to ease off because there is a lot more clarity now.
Now, Suresh, one of the points that was brought forward by the panel that I interviewed on Face the Nation several months ago, you all said if you go to the IMF, there will be a lot of confidence that will be built in the market, and as a result, we'll be able to get a lot of financing from bilateral agencies as well as multilateral nations. So in that context, how important do you think for us to be engaging with the IMF for a prolonged period of time to make sure that the confidence level increases in the market?
I think we need to engage long enough to get a good program going. A program that takes Sri Lanka out of this economic crisis, a program that puts Sri Lanka back on a growth path, and a program that gives confidence to the external financial markets that Sri Lanka is viable again.
And stick to it.
and stick to it, yeah. So I think to that extent, yes, I think we need to have a good program in place, and we need to do the debt restructuring properly. Sri Lanka's problem, we are seeing it as a liquidity problem, but it is also a problem of what do you call it? Yeah,
trade deficit.
No. It's a solvency problem.
Solvency problem.
Right?
Solvency.
But the moment you the moment you do the debt restructuring, right, the solvency problem goes out the window. So the markets will perceive Sri Lanka with a lot more confidence.
How long would that be?
Shanta probably is in a better place to answer that, but from what we've heard, IMF program going to take, with the debt restructuring, would take a minimum of 6 months. And I think we, as a plan B, we got to be ready for a longer period.
So,
but Samir, I think just along with that, this time, given where we have got into, if this is to work, that program, once we agree, it has to be presented, debated, and agreed by all sides of the House of lawmakers. If not, it will not work. There has to be buy-in from all sides of the House.
wishful thinking, Mr. Tyagaraja.
But I'm being realistic because again, if I can...
They are all irrational actors at the best of times.
But Nadim, that is the point we want to give the general citizens who are watching this program, because there is no point in having the best of brains deliberating this program if there is no buy-in, because this program will be a time-bound program. There will be short-term, but there will also be medium-term adjustments. And regardless of who is in power, the people who subscribe to it have to agree to it. If not, it will be just another failed program.
Right. So,
Nadim, and sorry, just to respond to what Nadim you just said, right, that irrational people. But I think there is a bit of a difference at this moment, and Shamir, it goes back to the question I think you asked Udara about heroes. Okay. Yeah. Now we may not, we may not have a hero in the political spectrum in that sense, but I think there are some very, very sensible people who are finally starting to advise government, right? People like Shanta, like Indrajit, the former governor. And I think even the current governor of the central bank, Nandalal, and Mahinda Sirivardhana, who is the Treasury Secretary, I think these, and I must also say, I've been very impressed with the way the current finance minister has, in this very short period of time, he's come across very positively. So I'm very happy about that as well. So I think there are some sensible people who are advising and who are in place right now to guide the Sri Lankan economy. And I think from that perspective, I'm a lot more confident now than I was, let's say, in January.
But Mr. Shah, let me point this out to you, and maybe you will be less confident. The constitutional amendment that is, given that both of you are former chairpersons of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, the draft amendment that has been put forward from the independent group by Mr. Vijaydas Rajapaksa makes reference, when it comes to appointments to the Constitutional Council, to one person being nominated by the Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce. Now, I looked through, did a Google search for this.
There isn't
went through the FCC ISL. This is a non-existent entity. So when I say these are irrational actors at the best of times, I mean that they basically put a half-sewn together amendment in a time of crisis. Mr. Vijaydas Rajapaksa has presented us with an amendment in which he's listed a non-existent entity. That is not something that inspires confidence.
You're right, Nadim. But my point was, there are people who are, nevertheless, there are people who are advising government at the moment who are technically sound. Right, and that's the point that I'm making. Yeah, I fully agree with you. You know,
that the ones in there are quite irrational.
That's a different ballgame. But at least we have some people who are advising them, who are sensible and who know what they're saying.
Right. So, Udara, interestingly, we're talking about the IMF and its role in Sri Lanka as far as navigating the country's economy is concerned in turbulent weather and turbulent times. How important is it to have a long-term development plan for Sri Lanka, at least now, which is not changing haphazardly based on the appointment of political authorities to the high echelons in the political hierarchy in the country?
So I think we should start with what is, you pose a question to Shanta about what is a good deal for the IMF. I think we should start with what does the IMF want to achieve from this. So, as far as I understand, the IMF's objective from these programs is to, as quickly as possible, for the country to be able to access the capital markets. For the IMF, that's a win. So the IMF's objective is to try and help implement a program that can help the country to achieve this. Now, this may not be the objective that is exactly what is in the country's interest. Now, Shant also mentioned it's very important that these programs are equitable, it serves the poor, helps the poor. But together with this equity or in sharing the burden of the current costs, we need to be thinking about growing through the crisis. Now, this is not a kind of a hypothetical or wishful thinking. If you look at Greece, which entered into restructuring agreements in 2009-10, of course the IMF was part of a troika there, but let's call this the IMF for the time being. 12 years later, the current per capita consumption is 30% less than that period. So that's after 12 years, 30% less consumption. Pensions are about half, 50%. And GDP, I think, is still well below the level that it was back then. So that's 12 years later. And this is a program which was very much focused on fiscal adjustment and austerity. Now, you can argue that there was enough space there. The Greek governments made mistakes. But ultimately, it is a path that we can very likely follow. And if we are not to follow this, we need to make very big changes now, and we need to focus, have as priority growth as well as equity in sharing the burdens of the crisis. In order for us to grow through the crisis, this goes back to this issue of what can Parliament and society in general agree on right now. So this means what are the principles in which who shares the cost of the crisis now, and what are the principles with which we go forward. So one principle is, do we focus on exports? For example, do we privatize the state-owned corporations? What do we do with the education sector? These are big questions which we need to have some general consensus on. Are these issues we can agree on now or not agree on now? But once we have the set of issues which we can agree on, then subsequent governments can, in a sense, be forced to abide by these through political will, through public pressure, to agree to these principles. But right now, what is very concerning is, I've maybe wasted my time looking at parliamentary sessions because they're on YouTube and Facebook. And it's amazing. It's the only country where there's no such thing as a debate. You have politicians getting up, giving a speech, then someone interjects saying their personal anecdote on why this person was wrong. Then another speech starts on a different topic. There's no coherent debate about any issue. And that's very dangerous, because this is really a very special type of crisis this country has faced. And even now, there's no debate about the economic policies or principles we can move towards. So really, that's what the country needs and should be demanding from the politicians that are in Parliament now, to get to some sort of coherency of the principles with which we can move forward. And people like Shant and the delegation at the IMF can use this to get the best possible deal. Because otherwise, they're kind of stuck with what they can promise and what they can push for. They haven't got any guidance from us.
Professor Devarajan, interestingly, the present government itself, members of the present government, portrayed the IMF to be the boogeyman as far as the country's economy is concerned. They come in, they're going to make everyone scared. It's going to be tough conditions. We won't be able to revive the country's economy. We have to have a domestic plan. This was reiterated by the then finance minister even during his budget speech. Former finance minister Basil Rajapaksa. Then we had the former governor of the central bank coming up with his own roadmap to revive the country's economy, so on and so forth. Is it that bad?
Is what that bad? I think those statements are pretty bad.
Is the IMF the boogeyman?
It's a completely false narrative. I really feel that was 180 degrees off. And let me explain to you why. The fact is that the IMF does not require anything that the country does not want to do. The way the IMF works is that the country proposes a program that they think is politically acceptable within the country. And if they propose a program that meets certain broad parameters, like the size of the fiscal deficit, then the IMF will provide financing for that program. So this is not the IMF dictating what should be done. It's the government of Sri Lanka that should be dictating what should be done, and going to the IMF to see whether that meets the criteria. The other thing is, the reason why the IMF has such a bad reputation is pretty much because they're usually called in when there is a crisis. And usually when there's a crisis, incomes go down. So they observe the IMF showing up and they see that per capita incomes go down. And they say, oh my God, this is the IMF's fault. It's a bit like when your house is on fire and you call in the fire brigade and they have to destroy parts of the house to save the fire, to stop the fire, you start blaming the fire brigade for the fact that your house is destroyed. This is really a myth that has been around. And frankly, I only hear this nowadays in Sri Lanka. I have not heard this in sub-Saharan Africa, where I spent most of my professional career working in the last 20 years. The fact that the IMF cuts social spending, I hear that all the time in this thing. It's a fact that the IMF actually has a rule that in no of their programs will they tolerate a reduction in social spending. That's a constraint. And as you may have seen in the press release a few days ago, the IMF has put as number one of its top three criteria the fact that there should be cash transfers targeted to the poor.
Suresh, interesting thoughts by Professor Shant Devarajan about the IMF's role. How bad is it going to be in the next few months for the private sector companies who are already being taxed heavily by the government? There was a surcharge tax that was imposed recently, which was approximately around 24%. Then they were paying another 24% additionally for taxes. So it was approximately around 48% of the taxes that companies had to pay. So in the long run, we have to make sure that the private sector of the country survives. How difficult is it going to be for the private sector, and especially those who are employed in these private sector companies?
So, at the end of the day, taxation is a result of profitability, right? And as long as corporates make profits, taxation is not such an issue. I must also say that Sri Lanka's, leave aside the super gains tax for a moment, that is a one-off, and a lot of us in the private sector really don't agree with the super gains tax. We felt that it should have been much broader than what it was, but that's another story. Leave that aside for the moment, though. Leaving that aside, I think the corporate tax rates in Sri Lanka are not too bad, judging by the region. And there may be even space to increase that taxation a little bit. I think the bigger challenge, though, Shamir, is the fact that the private sector is finding it difficult to get access to raw materials, imported raw materials for production because of the currency crisis. They're finding it difficult to get fuel to run their generators when there are power cuts. Mm-hmm. They're finding it difficult to distribute goods to the market because the trucks don't have fuel. So I think those are the bigger challenges that are being faced right now. And Shanta was speaking about a fiscal adjustment that needs to be made, and I think what that means is that taxes will go up. Corporate taxes are likely to go up. I think the VAT rate needs to probably go up. So I think
what about pay tax?
Yeah, I think the corporate tax rate and the pay tax rates generally will go hand in hand. Otherwise, there is arbitrage there. So I think that those will happen. So I think we need to be ready for the taxes to go up. I think the private sector understands this, and I think the private sector is ready. I remember a few weeks back, the joint chambers came out with a statement saying, we understand that taxes will have to go up. I think the bigger challenge is not in the realm of the taxation, but it's in other areas. But where the taxation is really going to have an impact, particularly if it's on things like VAT, for example, is on the people, on the citizens. And that's where the cash transfer system that Shanta was talking about is so very important. The sequencing. right? So, you know, we recently had a fuel price increase, and I think we are on the verge of having an electricity price increase. Taxes are likely to go up, but we need to get the sequencing right. So I think the absolute essential immediate priority is to work on the cash transfer that Shanta was talking about, and that needs to come before some of these other adjustments in taxes, etc. are made.
So Suresh, interestingly, after a week's holiday for the Colombo stock market, the Colombo stock market resumed operations this morning, and after a couple of hours, it plummeted to a level that they had closed on operations again. How is it? What sort of signals does it send to the investors who wants to invest in the Colombo stock market, which was once one of the best stock markets in the world?
You know, I'm extremely surprised that the stock market didn't foresee that we would have to close the exchange today. You know, the signal that you send by closing the exchange down for a week, I mean, it's such a bad signal that you send out. I expected the exchange to close today before.
You expected it?
Of course I did. Because, you know, the signal that goes out when you say your stock exchange is shut down for a whole week, it's not a good signal whatsoever. I think it does a lot more damage. It should not have been a decision that was taken. I believe the chamber requested that that decision was be reversed. So
but Suresh,
difficult to comprehend by that.
Suresh, they don't listen. Even now, they're not listening. Now, the chamber is an organization or a body that is comprising of professionals. Now, Mr. Tyagaraja was the chairman of the chamber at one point. You were the chairman of the chamber at one point, and I remember interviewing you when you were the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce as well. And even Mr. Tyagaraja when he was the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. Now, you all are professionals who can predict. Now, you said that you knew that this is going to happen. Why isn't it that even the stock exchange not listening to people of your caliber?
Well, maybe our communication strategy is not good enough. I don't know, or maybe they can't hear. It's got to be one of those two, right?
So, Mr. Tyagaraja, what is your opinion now? Professor Devarajan said that at least now the government is listening, so that is a positive sign. But it seems that still they have not learned a lesson.
So, okay, I would like to make a comment from a more broader perspective than the stock exchange itself. I fully agree with what Suresh said. I think the bigger picture for me is when we speak about fiscal adjustments or austerity programs, and even the chambers and the businesses agreeing for an upward adjustment in taxation, that is fine if the private sector is to bear that burden, as long as the impact of that results in productivity in the country. Because as Udara said, you have another part of this society, which is the state-owned engine, which also plays a predominant role in the development and growth of this country. So there is no point in only saying that the private sector will bear the burden on the tax and give it back to the country if there is another group of a significant group in the country which does not do its part in productivity. And that also boils down to a comment which I think you made some time ago earlier in this discussion. Are we still in the second industrial revolution when we should be on the fourth? Productivity, national productivity has to be looked at as part of this overall thing. It cannot be looked into isolation.
But we are talking about productivity, Mr. Tyagaraja, but we don't even have the gut to revoke the poor days in the country. We are one of the countries in the world which has a day off every month.
So all this, in my humble limited opinion, would be a part of the discussion, engagement, which I believe the government or those in authority, when they present this economic revival plan, that has to stand its test independently when it goes up for discussion before anybody gives any extension of support. So all these factors have to come in there, and they have to play their role in giving the robustness and sustainability of that revival plan, for whether it's the IMF or any other source, to give us that extended credit for the revival of this country.
From your perspective, given your experience in the private sector as a banker, as a former chairman, multiple banks, and as a former chairman of the Sri Lankan Chamber of Commerce, we are dealing with right now a president who has admitted two major blunders. One, in not approaching the IMF soon enough, or not foreseeing this impending crisis, and two, in the whole organic fertilizer debacle, where for some reason even, and I think we probably had to take on a personal blame for that, for not questioning who in government thought, whose bright idea it was that you could grow genetically modified seeds organically and then call it organic. So there were some major blunders there. And there are serious questions when you look at the illogical nature of the blunders that were made, the absolute preventability of it. You look at its almost mulish stubbornness that has brought us here. Is this a credible entity that anyone can deal with? Not let alone the international partners, even domestically in the private sector. Is this a credible entity that anyone can deal with?
So I think, as Suresh earlier alluded, this is an opportunity, time-bound, a unique opportunity for civil society along with business to get together and make that change and make sure that the systems are in place to do exactly what you know. To get you to a point, if you, again taking Udara's earlier comment, there is no evidence of any serious debate in Parliament on issues like this. We are giving this one person decides or a group of people decide. But in these sort of critical strategic national issues, I think that is why people are now saying it should be debated, deliberated and owned by the lawmakers. So I think this is the time. It's not about individuals, about together making that change once and for all to put into place the systems and processes to make sure we don't depend on individuals in future.
So a couple of weeks ago, Suresh, we had the chair of the Advocata Institute, who's also in financial services, Mr. Montaza Jafferji. And this was, I think, pre-default. We had Mr. Jafferji on the program, and he was saying that he is optimistic about the future because, like never before, Sri Lanka now has an opportunity to reset, to do a hard reset. Judging by what you have seen happening in the past couple of weeks, since almost a month ago when Mr. Jafferji made that statement, are you confident that we're moving towards that reset?
Yes, I say that because of the action that civil society has taken. You know, they've come out on the street, they're expressing their disappointment, they're expressing their frustration, they're expressing their anger. And I think that is the opportunity that we have. So yes, as long as the pressure is on and as long as the politicians are on the back foot, it gives us the opportunity to make that system change that I was speaking about. So that's why I think we need to really focus on that system change, and I think civil society needs to come together. You know, institutions like the Chamber, the Bar Association, the medical profession, the accountancy profession, we all need to come together to use this opportunity to push that change through. And if we succeed, then that's that hard reset that Murtaza was probably talking about. And also I must say, even from a government perspective, they are pushed against the wall to do certain things, right? You know, Sri Lankan governments do not like to, for example, increase fuel prices, but they had no choice, right? They don't like to take away price controls. They had no choice. They don't like to float the currency and get the markets to work. They had no choice, right? They don't like to increase interest rates the way that they were increased. They had no choice. So we are in that situation, backs to our, with our backs to the wall. We have no other way to go other than
no choices at all.
No choices at all.
People are making choices for us.
Yeah. So I think yes, it is a really good opportunity, and we should not let that opportunity go.
Professor Devarajan, interestingly now, we are engaged with the IMF, and the Minister of Finance had very clearly said that they are looking for an EFF, which is an extended fund facility from the IMF and not a rapid financing funding program.
RFI.
RFI. So do you think that we are on track or we are showing progress? It's still too early, but what sort of actions must we take immediately to obtain the EFF that the minister was talking about?
Yeah, I think we are on track as a result of these negotiations or the meetings last week, where both sides showed a willingness to reach an agreement. The actions that need to be taken are on two fronts. One is on the debt restructuring front, because to get an EFF, you have to show progress towards debt sustainability. The IMF board will not approve them unless there's some credible signals that the country is on the path towards debt sustainability. And so the next step is to actually appoint the legal and financial advisors and then begin the negotiation with the creditors towards debt sustainability. And on the adjustment front, I'd say, having done some of these other policies, I would emphasize again the cash transfers to the poor, as Suresh was saying, possibly ahead of some of the other reforms. And the state-owned enterprises restructuring or even selling off Sri Lankan Airlines and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and maybe Ceylon Electricity Board. And then the taxes, which involve three things, I would say. One is to lower the threshold that were raised in 2019 for both income taxes and VAT, broaden the base, and raise the rates. And I think the VAT rate should be raised maybe at about 1 percentage point a year over the next 4 or 5 years. That's basically the combination that I think is needed for an EFF. But remember, the EFF requires both an adjustment program and a significant step towards restructuring.
Right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your thoughts on the first and second round. We're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's the final round. We'll be talking to Professor Shant Devarajan, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, Suresh Shah, as well as Professor Dara Peris on their final thoughts on the way forward for the country. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back.
COVID-19 සරහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
තනිව යන්න බෑ කියන කාරණේ අධ්‍යාපනයේදී මේක මේ ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් සිදු වෙන දේ. අපිට රුසියානු සපත්තුව මේ ලංකාවට දාන්න බෑ, ඒක ලොකුයි. චීන සපත්තුව
FB එකෙන් News First ප්‍රවෘත්ති live බලන්න. අදම News First FB page එකට ගිහින් like කරන්න. ඉන්න තැනකදී live news බලන්න. දැනුවත් වෙන්න. ඇත්ත දැනගන්න. එය ඔබේ ITI.
දෙකේ එත පහේදී තමයි මේ වතු ඔක්කොම නැෂනලයිස් කරේ.
එහෙමයි ධර්මශ්‍රී, රට ගැන විතරක් නෙමෙයි මම ගැනත් මම බය වෙලා ඉන්නේ.
අපනයන කොහොමද කරන්නේ? කවුද විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද? නෑ. කවුද අපේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්නේ? විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයට ගියද? නෑ.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is economy on a knife edge. Is there a way out? Navigating Sri Lanka's economy in turbulent weather. We start off the final round with Professor Udara Peris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. What's the way forward for Sri Lanka?
I think we've started the first part with the discussions in Washington with the IMF and announcing the debt freeze, suspension of payments. The next step is to look seriously of the domestic debt situation and the domestic fiscal situation. And these two things are two different things, because the debt situation is also going to involve state-owned enterprises. The fiscal situation is going to involve what we can feasibly do with taxation. And what we really need, and I've said this many times, we need a mandate. We need a general agreement among Parliament. Maybe it's going to come from the protesters in Goldface, but wherever it comes from, it has to be a set of principles which we as a country can agree to commit to for the next 5 years. And these are going to be very loose principles of what we're going to raise taxes in, what we're going to reduce government spending in, and so on. And until we have this general set of principles, we're going to be always, every time there's an election, each government will pretend that they're going to change the current situation. And that's what we don't want. We want to have a continuous plan which is going to equitably share the cost of the crisis and help us to grow out of the crisis. And for this, we need to have a set of principles which we as a country can agree on for the next 5 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Udara Peris. I now move my attention to Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, Senior Banker and former Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce.
I think the first point is the fact that as a nation, we have recognized that we are in trouble, that we are in a sick bed. Recognizing and acknowledging it, that is a great start. Secondly, looking to go to the right sort of treatment centers and get the right sort of advice is also a good start. Important thing is to be able to listen. Of course, one takes your own decisions, but to be able to listen and get diverse points of view and then take an informed decision. And I think, as Shanta articulated, and I'm sure with the other two advisors along with him, a lot of rich advice will be given, and hopefully the government and the finance minister and his team will take due cognizance of it. But eventually, once this is done, going to the IMF alone is not the answer, has been articulated by many people in the market, that it has to be accompanied by a whole series of other policy reforms to support it. And once that is agreed, this is not somebody else thrusting something on us. It has to be developed and agreed by us as a nation. But once it is agreed, as Udara says, the proof of the pudding is whether the lawmakers as a whole will give their buy-in for at least a 5-year horizon. If not, we will be coming back in another 3 years with the same problem. So the ownership has to be taken jointly by that house, the House of Parliament.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja. I now move attention to Professor Shant Devarajan, a member of the Advisory Committee on Debt, former Chief Economist of the World Bank, who is joining us via Zoom tonight on Face the Nation. Your final thoughts, Professor.
Well, I think my final thoughts will build on what the previous two speakers talked about. And I want to pick up on something that Udara said earlier about the fact that there isn't real debate in Parliament on these policy issues. And take it one step further, there also isn't that much debate among the public. it's not a debate about policy. It's frequently a debate about personalities or ideology. And I think we need to move that to a debate about policies. The 5 points or 10 principles that Udara and Mr. Tyagaraja were talking about that we should agree on as a nation going forward, that should be debated, because there might be different perspectives around that. And let's see if there's a domestic political consensus building around that. And this may be the moment, because this is the people's moment in the history of Sri Lanka. And this is the time to have this kind of conversation about the principles. Regardless of who is in power, who's in charge, let's discuss the policy issues we need to go forward and make adjustments as the public opinion seems to dictate, and give that to the parliamentarians. So the parliamentarians, if they are debating or even if they're making speeches, they are speeches that are reflective of what the public is saying.
Thank you very much, Professor Shanta Devarajan, member of the Advisory Committee on Debt and former Chief Economist of the World Bank. I now give my attention to Suresh Shah, former Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, thank you, Shamir. So from on the economic front, I think three things. One is attend to the immediate requirements of getting the shortages sorted out and the queues out of the way, for which we need bridging finance, so we need to get that done. Secondly, we need to stabilize the economy, which is about the debt restructuring. It's about getting the IMF program sorted out. And it is also very importantly about bridging that fiscal deficit that Shanta was referring to. So that's the stabilization phase. Some of these, by the way, will run parallel. And then we need to put the economy back on a growth track. And that has to be driven by an export-centric focus, number one. Number two, we need to do the structural reforms, one of which is obviously the SOE reforms that were spoken about. There are other reforms that need to come in as well. You know, public service reforms need to come in addition to the SOE reforms. Taxation reforms will need to come in, and so on and so forth. So we need to put the economy back on a growth track. So from an economic perspective, those are the three things. But none of these will be sustainable unless we get the governance framework sorted out. And I think for that, we need to use this opportunity that we've got to pressurize the politicians to get that governance framework sorted out.
Thank you very much, Suresh Shah, former Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much, Professor Shanta Devarajan, member of the Advisory Committee on Debt and former Chief Economist of the World Bank, for joining us via Zoom tonight on Face the Nation. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, Senior Banker and former Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Suresh Shah, former Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce as well. Both have been very vocal about the country's economy on our past shows as well. And thank you very much, Udara Peris, Professor Udara Peris, Professor of Finance, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation. It was a pleasure to have the four of you talking about the country's economy and the way forward for Sri Lanka. I just hope and pray that those in government will listen to professional advice and take the right decisions, correcting their course in terms of this bad weather that we are facing at the moment, and take us in the right path for prosperity. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do, but not forgetting Nadeem and Deshan for joining us tonight on Face the Nation. Almost forgot, but you all two have been very instrumental as well to make sure that the program is good and is well watched. Thank you very much to both of you. And I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. When injustice becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. Take care and good night.